Hello and welcome to this session in the Global Azure Bootcamp on Windows Virtual Desktop. So my name is Tom Hickling. I'm a Windows Virtual Desktop Global Black Belt at Microsoft. That does not require any martial arts skills, but rather it just denotes a specialization, and as the name suggests, that specialization is in Windows Virtual Desktop. So just a brief intro to myself. I've been around in the enterprise IT space for well over 25 years. Architecting infrastructure for some large enterprise customers. It's always had a focus though on end user computing. I thought I'd escaped end user computing when I joined Microsoft as a cloud solution architect about 5 years ago. That was just helping lots of customers with any kind of infrastructure project in Azure. But as it always is the case, end user computer tends to pull you back in, and it did that for me. When Citrix released Citrix Cloud just over 3 years ago running in Azure. And I started then to focus on that, helping customers deploying virtual desktop deployments in Azure, which has then led on to my position as a global black belt for WVD. So now I help Microsoft customers in deploying WVD in their Azure subscriptions, as well as helping out the wider community. So let's start with an introduction to Windows Virtual Desktop, or WVD as I'm going to refer to it as. So this is a Microsoft management service for the orchestration in Azure of customers' VDI or single session desktops, as well as RDSH, so remote desktop session hosts, otherwise known as multi-session. So what this is a service running natively in Azure so that customers do not have to go and deploy all of the roles on virtual machines that they would have had to have done in the past up until this time. It is also the next major evolution of our RDS capabilities. So this has been the technology that has enabled this to work on premises. Now, what that in reality actually means is we are no longer dependent upon Windows Server for RDS capabilities. Now, Windows Server was released every 4 or 5 years, which meant that customers had to wait for that period of time in order to get new RDS capabilities. So we'll go into a bit more detail about what that looks like. But in essence, that dependency has been removed and has been replaced with Azure providing the underlying technology to support that service. So as part of WVD, we enabled a new feature of Windows 10 called Windows 10 Multi-Session. What this provides is the capability of having multiple users logged in simultaneously to the same Windows 10 VM. Now, this has never been possible up until this point in time. Now, this is a feature of WVD. It is not a Windows SKU that you can go and purchase and download and run on premises. This can only be run inside of WVD. We also support Windows 7 VDI, so this is a one-to-one mapping to a Windows 7 VM. Included with that is free extended security updates from January the 14th, 2020 for 3 years. We also support every flavor of Windows Server RDS from 2012 R2 and up, and it's one single service for the management of both published applications as well as published desktops from the one single service. And whilst this runs exclusively inside of Azure, it is actually a feature of M365 or Microsoft 365. What that enables is a lot of the features and capabilities that are inherent in Microsoft 365 can be used on top of WVD where it makes sense and where it's appropriate. So things like Azure Active Directory, conditional access, privileged access, those kinds of services become relevant with WVD. So this is a very high-level overview of the WVD architecture, and it's effectively made up of two boxes. The first at the top is the WVD management plane, and this is the component that is managed and operated by Microsoft. So from a customer's perspective, they do not need to do any forecasting of usage, any procurement, any ordering, any racking and stacking. There's no deployment, no ongoing patching, no support, no keeping this service alive. That's fully operated by Microsoft as an evergreen service to you, our customer. Now, when I mentioned earlier that this was the next major evolution of RDS, what that actually means is typically when customers did RDS or XenApp or Horizon on premises, they would go and deploy some virtual machines. Now let's take example this web access layer, so the remote desktop website. That's a website that had to be deployed on top of IIS, which was obviously installed into probably a couple or more virtual machines behind a load balancer for HA. Now that is not what is being deployed in Azure for this service. What's actually happened here is that website has been moved into Azure App Service. And Azure App Service is a large Azure service for the hosting of web applications. And we've got lots of customers whose entire business is built upon a single Azure App Service. And the rest, and that applies to the other services here. So what that means is that the RDS or the WVD product group are able to release updates into Azure at a much quicker cadence. We're talking weeks rather than potentially 5 years to get new capability out to our customers. And that obviously is running upon Azure. And Azure is getting updates across the board at a much quicker rate than that. So potentially there's updates dropping into the service every single day. So that's an example of how we have evolved the service and have broken that dependency upon releases of Windows Server. So that's the top management plane box. The second component is your Azure subscription. Now this is where you have absolute total control around what you deploy and how you architect it. So into here, you would deploy all of the virtual machines that you wanted for the hosting of your desktops and your line of business applications. Now, all of those virtual machines reside on what's referred to as a VNet or virtual network. So it's stock standard networking services here. But what that also opens up is the opportunity to connect back to any on-premise services. So we have a service called ExpressRoute, which is our recommendation for this type of workload, which will connect Azure back to your on-premise locations, enabling you to continue to consume any back-end services or any management services that you want to continue to manage these virtual machines. So something like SCCM or other services for software distribution, or something like an antivirus master server pushing out updates to these virtual machines. And then obviously all of those virtual machines reside upon our IaaS service. And that's where we manage up to the hypervisor, and then you manage the operating system and above. And this slide here shows you the Azure geographies where the current Windows Virtual Desktop gateway service is currently located. So every starred location on there is running the WVD management plane. All of these locations, or the service within those locations, sits behind a thing called Azure Front Door, which is doing the global load balancing for your incoming user connections through the management plane to those virtual machines. So you will be directed to the closest one of these starred Azure regions in order to consume the WVD service. So just for specific reference, these are the Azure geographies that the WVD management plane is currently available in. So it was originally available in the US and Europe, and then recently it has been rolled out to those geographies that you see listed there. And new Azure geographies will be coming on board over time. If you did want to estimate the user experience of your users connecting into the WVD management plane, you can go to this URL and it will take your DNS location and provide an estimate of that latency into that management plane. And so just as a reminder, these are the supported operating systems within WVD. So we support, as mentioned, Windows 7, and that's single session, so true VDI, and it is also published desktops only, so no remote app capability coming from Windows 7. We also support Windows 10 Enterprise single session, again, true VDI. And then we move into the multi-session capabilities. So this new flavor of Windows 10 multi-session, which we'll go into in a second, and then every flavor of Windows Server RDS from 2012 up. A bit more detail about Windows 10 multi-session. So up until this point in time, customers have only had two choices. of the virtual machines that they can deploy into this type of capability. The left-hand side here is explaining the Windows Server experience. Now, Windows Server by virtue of RDS has been great because of the scalability capability that it has. So you can have multiple users logged on to the same VM at the same point in time. Now, that's been great because it reduces your infrastructure, which in turn reduces your complexity and hopefully reduces your costs associated with that. However, it is Windows Server. Now, most users wouldn't be able to tell the difference because we can make it look like Windows Client, but it is Windows Server under the hood, and that's important to IT. It is multiple sessions, as we've mentioned, but it only supports Windows 32 apps here, so nothing from the store, if that was a requirement. It is Office 365 Pro Plus, but it is in our long-term servicing channel. So this is that dependency upon Windows Server being updated every 4 or 5 years or whatever it might be. Now, the problem with Windows Server has been application compatibility. Now, I'm sure you've come across at least one app out there that for whatever reason does not work on Windows Server. And when customers come up against an app like that, they typically mitigate that by deploying it via VDI, which is described on the right-hand side here. So VDI is great because it is that true Windows 10 user experience that customers are expecting, but it is obviously single session. So that's going to increase the requirements for infrastructure and obviously the costs associated with that, because you need more infrastructure to support the same number of users as you could use via RDS. It is, however, Windows 32 apps as well as anything from the store. So if you did want to deploy Edge or anything else from the store, then you can absolutely do that. It is also Office 365 Pro Plus, and it is in our semi-annual channel, which means that you will get 2 updates a year to Windows 10, one of which you can defer. Now, customers have really been articulating the problems inherent in both of these, and Microsoft have listened and have filled the gap between this new capability, which is obviously Windows 10 multi-session, which we think is the best of both worlds. And we say that because it's got the same or similar scalability as RDS, so you can have multiple users logged on to the same Windows 10 VM at the same point in time, combined with the true rich Windows 10 user experience that customers have come to expect. It also supports all types of apps, so Windows 32-bit as well as anything from the store. It is Office 365 Pro Plus, and it is in our semi-annual channel. So what that means is that with Windows 10 multi-session, you are getting an evergreen version of the OS combined with an evergreen version of Office being orchestrated by an evergreen management plane. So that's a brief intro to Windows 10 multi-session, but what about the virtual machines that you could potentially be running those on? Well, this is a non-exhaustive list of some of the virtual machine families that we have available in Azure that can be used in a WVD deployment. Now, typically, what we tend to find is that customers keep the virtual machines that they have for their users to a bare minimum. So it might be 3, maybe 4 virtual machine sizes. So something like small, medium, and large, and anything else is handled as an exception. Now that is done really to keep IT's life simple, because it takes time to deploy these virtual machines and it takes time to architect the choices available to those users. Now in Azure, we take care of all of that administration. So it takes exactly the same amount of time to deploy any type of these virtual machines. Plus, we only charge per second that these VMs are powered on. So what that means to you is that you have great choice and flexibility in terms of the virtual machines that you can make available to your users, because it makes no difference to you which ones that you make available. So we have families of virtual machines that are optimized for specific workloads. So we have sort of cheap and cheerful entry-level virtual machines. We have families that are optimized for compute, so more compute than memory, and then memory, which is the reverse of that. We have families of virtual machines that have GPUs within inside of them, families that are optimized for storage. Inside of each of these families, then there are multiple t-shirt sizes. So for example, the D series has around about 15 individual sizes within it, all of which you could consume inside of your WVD deployment. So those are some of our virtual machine families that you can deploy, but where can you deploy them? Well, this is back to our map, and this is the current 56 Azure regions that we have across the globe in 21 countries. Now you can deploy your virtual machines into any of these available Azure regions and connect them up into a WVD deployment. So if we go back to that previous slide that had the WVD gateway services located on the same map, the virtual machines can be deployed into any region, and then they connect up into those Azure geographies that has that WVD service running within it. Okay, so let's move on to load balancing. Now, out of the box, WVD has two load balancing mechanisms. The first is this thing called breadth mode. And what that does is it sends users evenly across all of the virtual machines that you have deployed inside of a host pool. Now, a host pool is just a collection of similar virtual machines. So you might have a marketing host pool or a host pool that has a certain set of applications. Now, this is nothing new. If you've done sort of Citrix and VMware or RDS for that matter, this is the stock standard load balancing mechanism. Now, this is actually not just a load balancing conversation. This is actually a pricing conversation or a pricing mechanism conversation. Breadth mode is actually aligned with reserved instances that we mentioned earlier. Reserved instances are where you pre-commit at a much reduced rate for the set of virtual machines, and it's really designed for virtual machines that are powered on 24/7. If you have these virtual machines already powered on, then this guarantees the best user experience by distributing those users evenly across the available virtual machines. Now, the reverse of breadth mode is a thing called depth mode, and that sends users to an individual virtual machine until it is considered full, and you get to set the threshold, and then it will power on the next virtual machine in that host pool. So this is now aligned with pay-as-you-go pricing for the virtual machine, where we only charge you per second that they're powered on. So the recommendation here is to have those virtual machines powered off for as much of the day as possible to reduce your Azure bill, and then only send users to the infrastructure that's powered on, and until the point that it hits that threshold, it will then power on the virtual machine, and obviously the reverse. So your Azure bill could be as small as possible. Okay, so moving on to Office improvements. Now, our telemetry is telling us that Office is one of the #1 suites of applications that's used in a virtual desktop environment out there in the wild. However, Office is also probably the #1 cause of problems in applications in a virtual desktop environment. So consider things like the OST file for Outlook in offline mode or cache mode, the OneDrive sync client. These really didn't work in a VDI environment. Now, that was really because the Office development team made the assumption that pretty much everyone out there was using a premium device at the desktop with unlimited resources, which is absolutely not the case. There are hundreds of millions of users using VDI out there to do their day job. So again, Microsoft listened to the feedback from customers around Office VDI, in particular non-persistent VDI, and have made two improvements that affect Office. The first is a whole slew of improvements in the Office code directly, taking into consideration VDI users of Office. The second is an acquisition, and that acquisition was FSLogix. Now, up until this point in time, many customers out there were buying third-party products to fill the gap that Office had in non-persistent VDI. One of those vendors was FSLogix, but there are others out there. So Ivanti is another example of this. Now that we've made the acquisition of FSLogix, the FSLogix capability is now effectively part of WVD. So customers no longer need to be purchasing any other products to resolve the problems that have been inherent in Office in VDI environments. Now, FSLogix has four main capabilities, two of which are particularly relevant to VDI environments, and those are profile containers and Office 365 containers. So how then does this container capability work? Well, onto the virtual machines running the VDI workloads is a small file system agent that redirects both reads and writes to the user profile to a VHD. That VHD is stored on some storage somewhere within your environment, and then when the user logs on, that VHD is mounted to whichever VM that they've logged in. So it follows the user and not the virtual machine. And then this agent will redirect both reads and writes to the user's profile to this profile container, which is mounted to that VM. So into that VHD will be the user's roaming profile. So this is far, far better than using roaming profile technology. That's because with roaming profiles, you are transmitting hundreds, if not thousands, of small files, which potentially can get corrupted in that process. This is block level transfer of that VHD, so it's extremely fast and almost completely eliminates the capability of corrupting that profile in that copy process. So that's the Office container does exactly the same thing for Office that the profile container was doing for the user's profile. So in this instance, anything from Office, so for example, the OneDrive sync client is the perfect example, is redirected to either the same VHD as the profile container or a separate one, which is typically the recommendation. Any apps that, like the OneDrive sync client, that need anything cached, those apps behave in exactly the same way, but rather than being written locally, they are being written to this VHD. And again, the same scenario, the user can log on to a completely new non-persistent VDI tomorrow. That Office container is mounted to that VM, and anything that was written into that is permanently updated, permanently available, and constantly hydrated. So that covers off things like the Outlook OST file, the OneDrive sync client we've mentioned, Windows Search, and anything else from Office that requires any kind of caching capability. So let's move on to connectivity into the WVD server. So this is the user connection flow. On the left-hand side are the clients that we support. In the middle is the WVD management plane. On the right-hand side are the virtual machines hosting your apps and desktop inside of your Azure subscription. The first thing that actually happens is the user is authenticated against Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory is a modern cloud-based identity provider that supports modern protocols like SAML, OAuth, OpenID, Connect. In this instance, the user is authenticated against Azure AD. Azure AD returns a token to the client. That client then presents the token to our web access layer. At this point, they're presented with some icons for the apps or desktops that they've been made available. They then launch one of those, and their connection goes via our gateway and is connected into the virtual machine hosting that app or desktop. At this point, we have RDP inside of HTTPS traffic flowing from the left-hand side all the way through to the virtual machine on the right-hand side. There is, however, a new capability with WVD called Reverse Connect. And what this is actually there's an agent running on these virtual machines in your Azure subscription. And they, when they start up, reach out to our management plane to say, I'm ready to accept a connection. And that previous slide, that process happens, and the inbound connection is brokered, as you'd imagine, by our brokering service, and it connects that inbound connection from the client to that outbound connection from the virtual machine. So what that means is you do not need any inbound ports opened on these virtual machines. The only requirement is for an outbound 443 connection going from these virtual machines into our management plane. So we mentioned the clients previously. These are the clients that we currently support. So we obviously have a Windows client, there's an HTML5 browser client, Android, as well as Mac OS and iOS. In terms of support for thin clients, then currently it's either Windows 10 IoT or a Linux client. So we have released a Linux SDK against which the thin client vendors are currently developing their thin OSs. Now, iGel are the only thin client vendor that has already gone GA with their support for WVD. The other main vendors are also currently developing against that Linux SDK to provide that support against their thin clients. And just one point to be aware of, there are some differences in the features that are available per client that you might choose to use. So as you would imagine, the Windows client has the broadest set of capabilities compared to, let's say, for example, the HTML5 client. Okay, so let's move on to understanding the prerequisites that you need in order to run. So this is the high-level process. The first thing is, as always, is understanding the users and the applications that you have in scope for any kind of virtual desktop environment. WVD doesn't resolve that issue, and that is still a requirement of you to understand what it is that you are trying to present to your users. The second thing is to understand the authentication model. So we currently require, as we've seen earlier, Azure AD as well as Active Directory. And we'll go into a bit more detail about the options there for providing Active Directory. And then your tenant design. So which Azure subscription, which Azure AD tenant are you going to consume? And then your host pool design. So are you going to be publishing apps or desktops or both? Are they going to be pooled or personal desktops, so persistent or non-persistent? The virtual machines that you're going to choose. So are you going to have lots of small ones or perhaps a lower number of larger virtual machines? Your load balancing mechanism. Each host pool can be one or the other. You can change them, but at any one point in time, they can only be one. Your networking that these virtual machines in your host pool will reside upon, and the connectivity. So things like DNS and connectivity back to anything required on premises, as well as the profile storage. So enabling an SMB file share for the storage of those FSLogix profiles. And these are the design decisions that you need to make in advance for Windows Virtual Desktop. As we mentioned, there is an identity strategy that you need to decide upon. We mentioned that you require Azure Active Directory, but these virtual machines that you log into are still Windows VMs that require to be domain joined. That then means that you need Active Directory. And we have a number of choices available to you today. You could use Azure Active Directory Domain Services. So this is a PaaS-based Active Directory service that we operate on your behalf. And effectively, we provide you with 2 IP addresses, which you can use to point the Active Directory management tools against, and you get a slightly cut down version of Active Directory. But it's really designed for organizations that don't want to manage Active Directory domain controllers, but still have a requirement for directory services. So that's one option, and it's really for cloud-only accounts or identities. The second thing is to have a traditional domain controller available. So that could either be located inside of Azure, so placing that on a virtual network that the WVD session hosts have access to, or to have line of sight of a domain controller that's still on premises, so either over ExpressRoute or a VPN. The second thing is to choose where you're going to place your FSLogix profiles, of which there are a number of choices. So you could spin up some file server based storage services. So Microsoft Storage Spaces Direct is one example, but there are other vendors available in the Azure marketplace that offer this kind of service. So SoftNAS is one example of that. You could use Azure Files today with Azure Active Directory Domain Services integration. We have just gone into preview for Active Directory integration, but it's not there yet, but that will be coming in the next few months. Or you could use another service, Azure NetApp Files. So this is a fully Microsoft-owned service running NetApp technology under the hood. So that's, again, another great service for hosting an SMB file share upon which you can place your FSLogix profiles. And then you also need to make sure that you have all of the credentials that are required in order to deploy an end-to-end WVD deployment. So that's obviously an Azure subscription admin account, an Azure Active Directory global admin account, an Active Directory admin account for doing the domain join for the session hosts to your Active Directory, and then a WVD tenant admin. So this is a user account that does your WVD specific administration. And these are the prerequisites again for the user requirements in a little bit more detail. So for WVD, we require an Azure subscription with a user account that has at least contributor access to either a resource group or the entire Azure subscription. We need to have an Azure Active Directory user account that has global admin, and this is to consent that the WVD service can consume your identities from your Azure Active Directory. We also require Azure AD Connect that's syncing user accounts from your Active Directory, wherever that might be, up into the Azure Active Directory that you're using. And then optionally, if you did want to do federation, you can use ADFS or some other third-party federation service to be redirecting those authentication requests back to an on-premises domain controller. We also, as mentioned, require Active Directory. So we have to have that line of sight of a domain controller, and we need to have an account that has at least domain join permissions so that we can join those virtual machines that are deployed in a WVD host pool into your Active Directory. And then finally, although it is optional, is connectivity back to on-premises. So there's two options here: ExpressRoute, which is our private, dedicated, low latency connectivity back to on-premises, or a site-to-site VPN. Where those accounts are required. So the WVD admin is just administering the WVD tenant. The Azure subscription admin just has permissions over your Azure subscription to deploy infrastructure, so virtual machines, virtual networks, for example. Your Azure AD global admin account just has permissions over your Azure AD and is only required to consent the WVD service to consume your Azure AD, as well as the Active Directory admin. So this is just having permissions over your Active Directory. So deploying WVD comes in 4 relatively simple steps. The first is to grant AD consent. So we are saying that the WVD service has the ability to read identities inside of your Azure AD in order to authenticate them onto the service. We then need to assign a tenant creator. So this is just an Azure AD user account that has the capability to create a tenant, which is then used via PowerShell to go and create a tenant inside of the WVD service. And then finally, from the Azure Marketplace is the capability to go and deploy a host pool. So this will actually deploy the virtual machines that will reside upon your virtual network. So let's now move on and discuss partners. WVD Management Service has a full REST API against which partners can develop to add their value on top of a standard WVD deployment. And we have many partners in this space, too many to mention here. But our long-standing partners of Citrix and VMware are there, as well as some smaller point product partners. So people like iGel, we've mentioned, NetApp, FinPrint, who can provide advanced printing capabilities on top of WVD. Now, every customer I go to speak to asks me, are you competing against Citrix or are you competing against VMware? The answer to that question is a clear no. We are not competing against either Citrix or VMware. Now, Citrix have a product called Citrix Cloud that, as well as VMware, are the only vendors who are enabled to provide Windows 10 multi-session via their cloud services. And this high-level architecture is the Citrix Cloud high-level architecture. And what you will see is very similar to the WVD architecture. So on the left-hand side, you have all of the Citrix-specific technology, so Workspace, the NetScaler service. You also have in the middle the Azure subscription of the customer, where they go and deploy all of their virtual machines, including the WVD entitlement that enables them to run Windows 10 multi-session. And obviously that's all running on top of our IaaS service. You get asked, well, what value does Citrix add? Well, the value that they have added over the last 30 or so years continues. And that paradigm will not change with WVD. So if there's anything that you see on this list that you or your customer requires and cannot live without from Citrix, our recommendation is to continue with Citrix by virtue of Citrix Cloud as well as taking advantage of the WVD services that you're also entitled to consume. And exactly the same way that also applies to VMware with Horizon Cloud on Azure. Now this isn't available yet, it's currently in preview and it's due to go GA in March 2020. But again, if you have any requirement for Horizon type capabilities, then our recommendation is to stick with Horizon Cloud in conjunction with Azure and WVD. So let's move on to our final section, the WVD. Two areas: current capabilities that are in preview or will be released very soon, and then a longer term roadmap for WVD, of which there is a long list of capabilities and features that will arrive. This is a non-exhaustive list. Now, some of these new capabilities, we mentioned iGel have support for thin clients today. So if you did need thin client support with WVD, go and speak to iGel because they have already announced support for WVD. But other thin client vendors are actively developing against our Linux SDK to provide that support natively in their thin OSs. So look out for announcements from other thin client vendors. We also have a public preview of Azure Files support for Active Directory integration. What this enables customers to do is apply NTFS ACLs across an Azure Files SMB file share location. What that then opens is the capability to have user profiles stored on Azure files. So it's a great location for storing FSLogic's user profiles, as well as for storing departmental file shares. We are also currently developing Teams optimizations natively into the Teams client. And what this will do is it will redirect voice and video calls from WVD down to the local device, which will then establish a WebRTC peer-to-peer connection with the recipient rather than hairpinning that up and down to Azure. And then obviously the screen refreshes of that call are then presented back into the WVD session. So there is a Teams tap program that customers can sign up to see that capability. We also have some improvements in the admin experience for WVD. What that means is support inside of the Azure portal natively for managing a WVD deployment, as well as a preview that you can sign up for the MSIX app attach. So this is the combination of two things: MSIX app packaging, which is an existing packaging format, in conjunction with app attach, which is an efficient way of attaching these MSIX apps to a WVD session. And then on the longer term WVD roadmap, we have a number of items. So we're currently under development, but will take some time, is Azure AD only support. So what this will provide is the capability of removing the requirement for Active Directory. So you'll be able to sign into the WVD service using your Azure AD credentials, as well as sign on to the virtual machines. We will not remove the support for AD. So some customers like the capability of having their domain controllers doing that authentication. So we will provide customers with the choice of both of those services. We will also have Intune support in the future for managing the WVD session hosts from Intune, as well as supporting UDP. So today it's TCP only, UDP support is coming. We also are under development for an event-based scaling service. So currently today we have an Azure Logic app which provides some scaling based upon calendar events as well as user load. A much more rich, robust scaling service is currently under development and will be released soon, as well as a feature that we're referring to as RDP short path. Now what this does is it enables customers to connect to their session host in Azure across ExpressRoute directly. So the user connection does not go via the management plane, but rather goes directly to that virtual machine. So that has the capability of significantly reducing latency to those virtual machines. The other thing to bear in mind and to take away in terms of roadmap is that WVD is now a Azure service. And what that means is that some of the capabilities that pre-exist in Azure, or new capabilities that come to Azure that have some type of support or benefit for a virtual desktop, will then also become available. So Not to say that this is on the roadmap, but things like our machine learning service, also our IoT hub service, which is taking and managing events from billions of IoT devices out there across the planet. This means that Azure is aware of IoT events, so things like smart buildings and smart security barriers at the front of buildings that allow users to come into the building. If Azure is aware of those events, then we could potentially take advantage of that in our scaling service. The point here is that Azure is a rich and wide platform that has a plethora of services, many of which have some kind of impact on a virtual desktop. So the future is now no longer, as we mentioned, dependent upon Windows Server, but rather on Azure and the broad set of capabilities that Azure can bring in the future to a virtual desktop. And this is just a sneak peek at the Azure portal integration. If you've been into Azure before, you will recognize the user experience here. So it's nothing new if you've done Azure before, but rather than managing this via PowerShell, you can now manage your WVD deployment natively inside the Azure portal. And so finally, let's just have a look at MSIX App Attach. So currently with a physical workstation, and for some virtual machines, this might be true, all of the components required to make up a user environment are very closely linked or coupled together. So the apps to the operating system, the user profile to both the apps and the operating system. So not an ideal solution, particularly for non-persistent VD. Now, what FSLogix has done via the user profile is to be able to completely and utterly separate the user profile from the operating system, enabling customers to have VDI that's effectively cattle, and users can just log into any virtual machine and their user profile is currently up to date. But what about the applications? What can we do? Well, that's exactly where MSIX App Attach comes in. So MSIX App Attach is actually the combination of two things. MSIX, which is a pre-existing packaging format, in conjunction with App Attach, which is a new capability of presenting those apps to WVD session hosts. Now, it's not actually FSLogix capability here, but it is doing this in the very similar way to how FSLogix presents the user profile. And it does that by expanding an MSIX app into a VHD. That VHD is then mounted on demand to the virtual machine that the user is logged into, and the application is effectively registered to the operating system. At that point, the app appears to the OS and to the user as if it is locally installed, and they can consume that app as if it were. As soon as that VHD is deregistered or dismounted from that virtual machine, there is no remnant whatsoever of that application. So it has absolutely no impact on that virtual machine. So this really then enables that complete separation of both the user profile as well as applications from the virtual machine. The virtual machines end up just being a sprawl of cattle that you really don't care too much about, because you are managing the user's persona as well as the user's applications completely separately from those virtual machines. So it's a very elegant way of presenting apps to virtual machines, in particular into WVD session hosts, and will become the standard recommendation for how we deploy applications and make them available to users in a WVD deployment. So let's move on to our final section, which is licensing for WVD. So this might be slightly boring for our technical folk, but it is important, particularly for large enterprises who are doing virtual desktop at scale, for whom this can become a very expensive estate in their environment. So what can happen with WVD is some significant cost reductions for an overall WVD deployment for many thousands of users. Now, WVD is not actually licensed itself, so you can't go and buy a license to use WVD. It's actually licensed via other products, and it may well be that you already own the licenses that entitle you to use WVD. So I'm not going to list them all, but you can see the licenses that are listed down there. If you have, for example, Microsoft 365 E3 or above, that means you're already eligible to be running Windows Virtual Desktop, and in particular running our client OSs within WVD, so Windows 10 as well as Windows 7. If you do choose to deploy Windows Server with RDS, there is still a requirement for a CAL for that workload, but that is not applicable if you are deploying Windows 10 multi-session, which, just as a reminder, enables a similar type of scalability that's available from RDS. But the main point here to take away is that you are eligible to use WVD by virtue of a license that you probably already own. So that's the licensing. However, there will be some Azure usage charges associated with the infrastructure that you deploy. So for example, if you deploy 100 virtual machines, then your Azure bill is going to reflect that. Now, this opens up the opportunity for seeing some cost savings by taking advantage of things like reserved instances. This is the capability to pre-commit for 1 or 3 years for a set of virtual machines at a significantly reduced rate compared to pay-as-you-go. So that can be up to 70% cheaper using reserved instances over pay-as-you-go. Or you can consider going pay-as-you-go and then having the capability of powering these virtual machines off when they're not in use. So there are tools inside of Azure and some of our partner solutions that enable you to automate the powering off. And obviously, our recommendation is to have these VMs powered off for as long as possible so that your Azure bill would also reflect that. Okay, so let's move on to the benefits of WVD, in particular the cost savings and the efficiencies that are now possible. Now, if anybody's seen the shared services model, which is applicable to cloud workloads, you will have seen the comparison between what we used to do on premises versus IaaS, so infrastructure as a service, compared to PaaS, platform as a service, compared to software as a service. So this is a perfect example of that working in the flesh. On the left-hand side is the traditional RDS deployment with all of the individual components that customers had to go and deploy in order to present apps and desktops and the data associated with those to their user estate. Whereas WVD, as you can see here, Microsoft is taking away the requirement for the customers to manage a whole chunk of that undifferentiated heavy lifting that customers, or that all customers have to do in order to get their users consuming the service. So what that means is there are significant cost benefits of using WVD, and they really fall into 3 main areas: the infrastructure, the licensing, and the labor costs associated with the management of a traditional RDS deployment. So the first cost saving in our infrastructure space is really this Windows 10 experience, but coming at a multi-session cost. So as we've seen before, Windows 10 up until this point has been single session only. So 1 virtual machine to 1 user. Windows 10 multi-session enables us to have multiple users all logged on to 1 virtual machine. Now that might admittedly be slightly larger, but it's the same scalability that we've always had with RDS now applied to Windows 10. Now there will be significant cost savings that can be achieved here by, instead of having lots of smaller virtual machines, having far fewer slightly larger virtual machines to support the same number of users. Now in our example here, which is a slightly generic example, we are suggesting that you can get up to 85% discount or savings, I should say, compared to running this on a traditional Windows 10 single session VM on premises. Now again, your mileage may vary, but the principle stacks up that you will see cost savings by virtue of consuming Windows 10 multi-session over single session. So the second infrastructure advantage here that's made available only by Azure is that customers no longer need to deploy their infrastructure for the peak workload. So anything between this red line and the blue line is effectively wasted infrastructure because it's not being consumed by your user estate. So one of the benefits of running WVD on Azure is that you can auto provision infrastructure based upon actual user demand. So you're no longer building for the peak usage and having any wasted infrastructure that's not being consumed. So your infrastructure can follow your actual user patterns. What you can also do is combine both pay-as-you-go which would probably be the blue line, in conjunction with reserved instances. So users or virtual machines that you know need to be powered on pretty much 24/7. And the combination of both of these, again, will enable you to achieve some cost savings. Again, your mileage may vary, but the principle stacks up. Again, that if you are provisioning only for the actual usage rather than the peak demand, you will again be able to achieve those cost savings. So the next cost benefit that's applicable to WVD is the fact that the session host VMs, so these are VMs that are actually hosting your desktop or your applications, are only charged at the Linux rate, or what we refer to as the base compute rate. So VMs inside of Azure have two prices, the Windows price and the Linux price. And that cost difference can be around 50% per virtual machine. Now, by virtue of the licensing that you require in order to run WVD, you've effectively paid for Windows licenses. So these session host VMs are not charged at the Windows rate, but rather at that Linux rate. So that enables you to see some significant cost savings once again compared to running these standard Windows virtual machines. Now that's only applicable to the WVD specific virtual machines. It's not applicable to any associated VMs that you might run for potentially hosting a file server share or any license servers or any other servers for that matter. It's only applicable to those WVD session host VMs. So the next licensing saving that you can achieve with WVD is again a feature of Windows 10 multi-session. So as we mentioned earlier, if you are deploying RDS, so Windows Server with RDS, there is still a requirement for CAL. If you're deploying Windows 10 multi-session, there is no requirement for a CAL. And so what that absolutely means is that you will be saving $17 per user per month by deploying Windows 10 multi-session over deploying Windows Server RDS. At the beginning, we also mentioned Windows 7, which also receives extended security updates until 2023. What customers can achieve is the cost benefit of not having to pay for those extended security updates if they have on-premises Windows 7 that they also want to receive these security updates for. So again, over those 3 years, customers can see between $25 to $20 savings per device per year. So the final area of cost savings is the fact that WVD is a management service that's operated by Microsoft. So no longer do your IT admins need to be managing multiple different services on lots of virtual machines within your data center, taking up time and obviously generating costs. WVD, as we've mentioned, is a management service that's included in licenses that you already own. So you can now save the time and the cost associated with all of that management for all of that infrastructure, allowing your IT admins to concentrate on providing more value back to your user estate. And this is just a simple generic pricing example for 100 users using WVD, which we've split into sort of the industry standard user personas of task, knowledge, and professional worker, as well as power workers who are really users that require a GPU inside of the virtual machine for graphics intensive applications. So we are just using our sort of standard recommended virtual machine of a D8SV3. And what you can see on the final right hand side column is the estimated cost for the compute and storage associated with those 100 users in each of these categories. And what you can see there is it's roughly £3.50 for 100 task users, going up to £6.70 for professional workers, and then a little bit of a jump up to £20 for those power workers. But what you can see is that in most cases, this is a very cost-effective solution for running users across WVD. Okay, so that's brought me to the end of my session. So thanks for sticking with me. Hopefully you found it interesting and have learned something about WVD. If you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to me. You can see my email address there. You can also follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn. And I've also got my website there where I post a number of blog articles about interesting things coming from WVD, including some content which I upload to my GitHub repository, as you can see there. So once again, thanks very much and speak soon.